Okay, welcome to Talmudim Way and our seventh lesson in Revelation backgrounds. Today we'll be covering Jesus' letter to Smyrna. We find that in Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Acts 17:11 reminds us that those Bereans were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. We're going to come across a phrase called the Jews who say they are not, and they're from the synagogue of Satan. And I have a major problem with the way that many commentators interpret this verse. First of all, I feel they're breaking rule number one of Bible interpretation. But more than that, I think that they are approaching it from a position of accusing and really blatant anti-Semitism. And I just think all of that is wrong. If we call ourselves believers and followers of Jesus, our behavior should be better than that. So I think the interpretation is wrong, and I think the motivation is wrong. So don't take my word for all this. I'll tell you the theory that I've landed on. There's a couple of them out there that are more true to the text. But again, as Acts 17:11 says, don't believe a word I say. Check it out for yourself. So these are our topics. We'll look at the background of Smyrna. We have a lot less to say about Smyrna than we did for Ephesus, just because we just don't know that much about it. Today there's a modern city that sits on top of it, so there hasn't been the archaeological excavations to the extent that there has been for Ephesus, say. Then we'll look at the structure of each letter. Then now normally there are 7 elements, but Smyrna is conspicuous in that there's no judgment section. So that'll get our attention, and we'll kind of explore what that might mean. And then there's a statement, the Jews who say they are not. We'll explore that a little bit. And then we'll close by looking at the possible tie-ins to those 3 theories, the church age theory, the possible tie-in to the Matthew 13 parable, and the letter of Paul that is seen as being connected to the letter to Smyrna. Let's go ahead and read the passage. To the angel of the Messianic community in Smyrna, write, here is the message from the first and the last, who died and came alive again. I know how you are suffering and how poor you are, though in fact you are rich. And I know the insults of those who call themselves Jews but aren't. On the contrary, they are a synagogue of the adversary, or your Bible may say of Satan. Don't be afraid for what you are about to suffer. Look, the adversary is going to have some of you thrown in prison in order to put you to the test, and you will face an ordeal for 10 days. Remain faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your crown. Those who have ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the Messianic communities. He who wins the victory will not be hurt at all by the second death. So let's look at some of the geography and history of Smyrna. So very much like Ephesus, it had a deep harbor, and that led to economic prosperity, although Smyrna was never as commercially significant as Ephesus was. You can see on the map in the inset that Smyrna was about halfway between Ephesus and Pergamum. It's about 42 miles to the north of Ephesus. And what's interesting is that, like Ephesus, the harbor eventually silted over. And so today the modern shoreline is a few miles to the west. Through earthquakes, the city was destroyed and then rebuilt multiple times. And it really came into prominence when Alexander the Great resettled the area and wanted to build a magnificent city. In fact, Strabo, the great geographer of antiquity, called Smyrna the most beautiful city in Ionia. Unlike Ephesus, Ephesus tended to pick the wrong side during the great battles of antiquity. Smyrna didn't. In fact, they were steadfastly loyal to Rome even before Rome came to power. They built a temple to Roma, which was the deified personification of Rome in 195 before the Common Era, and this is way before Rome came to prominence. Smyrna was in Greek hands at this time, so they're siding with this upstart. You know, they hedged their bets, and that paid off well for them. Like Ephesus, the culture was deeply seated in what we would call the Roman imperial cult. They were described as being, quote, loyal to Rome and its gods even unto death. And this is likely one of those local allusions, or maybe even a pun, that Jesus made in verse 10 when he says, be faithful unto death and I will give you the crown of life. So he was kind of playing on this motto that Smyrna had, that they were loyal and faithful to Rome and its gods even unto death. So we see an example of emperor worship on this inscription that was found at Smyrna, and it's a dedication to Hadrian. and it describes Hadrian as Olympian, savior, and founder. And so by calling him Olympian, they're basically saying Hadrian is equivalent to Zeus. And by calling him savior, it's no accident that they're challenging the status of Jesus as savior. And by founder, they're kind of in a way saying he's the first and the last, and that's why Jesus says Jesus says I'm the first and the last. So in Smyrna, emperor worship was mandatory as it was throughout the empire. The law required citizens to make an annual offering to the emperor and acknowledge publicly that the Caesar was the supreme lord. And once they did this, they actually received a written certificate that says they had done this, and then they were permitted to move about the city freely and worship whatever gods they wanted at that point. As we have noted, Judaism was a protected religion, so they were exempt from having to do this by law, but Gentile believers were not. And so this led to growing tensions between Jews, both believing and non-believing Jews, as well, in opposition to the Gentile followers of Yeshua. They were following a Jewish Messiah, but they didn't have any religious protection. And actually the former group, the Jews, they were called to publicly denounce the latter group, the Gentiles. So they were, kind of had this problem going on. And so this lack of proper papers, showing the group refused to worship Caesar, added to this pressure that the believers were experiencing in Smyrna. So there have been some archaeological excavations done in Smyrna, and this shows an excavation of the Agora, and you can see the arches there, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So the Agora was the marketplace. It also served as the civic forum, and all of this was under the watchful eyes, in quotes, of Zeus, Poseidon, Demeter, and Artemis. So there were statues and idols all over the place. It appears that the Cybele, the Phrygian mother goddess, was actually the patron goddess of Smyrna. We might say the patron saint of Smyrna. And according to legend, Cybele is the mother of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, and they've found numerous coins minted in Smyrna that bear the image of this Cybele. And so you can see these many arches, and what archaeologists think that those are for is that they supported the Agora following the earthquake. So they kind of reinforced the roof of the marketplace, and then all that's left today are the arches. So there's another possible allusion that Jesus makes when Jesus refers to himself as the one who died and came to life, because as we mentioned, Smyrna was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, often by earthquake. There was one in 178 of the Common Era that destroyed the area, and that's where you see that these arches were built. There was another big one in 179 before the Common Era that destroyed much of the city, and the city had to be rebuilt that way. So we don't want to make too much of it, but in some sense the city was dead and then came back to life, just as Jesus says, "I'm the one who died and came back to life." So this might be one of those local references that the Smyrnans would have appreciated. So again, today there's a modern Turkish city, and it's called Izmir, that sits on top of where we believe the ancient Smyrna was located. And this has really limited archaeological excavation. And because of this, we're unable to confirm any significant Jewish or Christian presence in the city, at least at the time Revelation was written. Scholars, though, will point out absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There's enough written documentation that says there was a sizable Jewish presence there. Bolin points out that the modern city of Izmir has a long history of Jewish residents, and there are a number of synagogues in the area of the historic city, and at one time there were 9 Jewish synagogues located on a single street, and you can see a picture of one here called the Shalom Synagogue. So of the 7 cities mentioned in Revelation, only Smyrna today survives as an inhabited city. So that's kind of interesting. The other 6 are just now tourist locations where we can visit remains, but Smyrna is actually a thriving, I think, the 3rd largest city in Turkey today. Although Revelation 2 is the only mention of Smyrna in the Bible, we do believe Paul traveled up to Troas, passing through Smyrna and Pergamum on his way to Greece, and I talked about that when we looked at the map, and that you can find that in Acts 20. Paul also spent more than 2 years in Ephesus, so he could have made a trip to Smyrna, and as a side trip. Acts 19 verse 10 states, "This continued for 2 years, so that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks." So it's clear that there lots of evangelistic activity was going on. Other than the reference in the book of Revelation, Smyrna may be best known to Christians as the town where the church father Polycarp was murdered, and this occurred in the mid-2nd century. Polycarp was a disciple of John, and he was the bishop of Smyrna. Now, a later tradition has all of this being orchestrated at the hands of non-believing Jews, but this appears to be an anti-Semitic addition. We mentioned that early church was very anti-Semitic, and unfortunately that's changed a lot of our views of the Old Testament and separated us from the Jewishness of Jesus and that kind of thing. So that's been really tragic. But the history really shows this persecution was at the hands of the Romans. The earliest records indicate that Polycarp was brought before the provincial governor, and De Silva in his commentary writes, the governor might not have known about the Christian faith, but he knew that it drew people away from giving the gods their due. And so for this reason, the sect of the Nazarenes, the Jewish believers and non-Jewish believers, were seen as an existential threat to the Roman way of life, and they had to be dealt with. Especially given Smyrna's status as, Rome's oldest and most faithful of allies. They just couldn't tolerate this happening there. The Martyrdom of Polycarp is a document that records all this. It may be embellished in places, but the key takeaway that I think a lot of people have already heard is that the city officials said to Polycarp, "What harm is it to say Caesar is Lord and to offer a sacrifice?" And then Polycarp responded, "For 86 years I have served him, and he has wronged me in no way. How then can I revile my king who rescued me?" And so at this refusal, and then you can see in the picture on the slide, Polycarp was then ordered to be burned at the stake. Now the story goes, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel, the fires danced around Polycarp but did not harm him. And so when the fire failed to do the job, then he was ordered to be stabbed to death, and that killed Polycarp. So the story and how much of it's true we don't know. It does illustrate Jesus's no compromise position to his faithful, and particularly the faithful at Smyrna. So even though the letter came before the martyrdom of Polycarp, Jesus's message was no matter how bad things get, and even to the point of death, we must hold fast. We must never deny him. And so conversely, for Christians, we know that the end of our lives, in this world is not the end of the story. Along with the story of Polycarp, the letter to Smyrna in Revelation reminds us to keep the heavenly perspective. And so that just serves as a reminder not to get too focused on earthly things, but to keep our eyes focused on heaven. And to the angel of the ecclesia or messianic community or the church in Smyrna, write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. We mentioned previously that the town's meaning often has significance, and it really does in this case. Smyrna is related to the word for myrrh, M-Y-R-R-H, and myrrh we see in the Bible is used for a number of reasons. It can be a perfume, but primarily it's used as an embalming ointment. And so as you can see in this photo, it starts out as like a crystallized resin, and it has to be crushed to activate its full potential. And I think there might be a lesson for us as believers, given what we're about to read. This pressing and crushing is what Jesus is telling the people of Smyrna to expect. So Smyrna was one of the chief exporters of myrrh to the ancient world, interestingly enough, so that's probably how it got the name. We mentioned in the Ephesus lesson how many of the goods listed in Revelation 18 would have passed through the ports of Western Turkey. And if we look at 18 verse 13, myrrh is specifically listed in those goods. So I think that's interesting. We may know myrrh as one of the 3 gifts the Magi brought at Jesus' birth, along with gold and frankincense. And we can read that in Matthew 2 verse 11. So scholars see these 3 gifts as speaking of Jesus as king, which is the gold, as priest, which is frankincense, and then his office as a prophet. And most biblical prophets died as martyrs, and so that's why myrrh becomes a symbol of his death there. We see myrrh mentioned twice at Jesus' death. So there's one time he was on the cross at Mark 15:23, and they're offering him myrrh as a type of anesthetic. And you can see on the screen in John 19:39, Nicodemus came to embalm Jesus after his death, and he brought myrrh and aloes along about 75 pounds in weight. Chuck Mister points out that in Isaiah 60 verse 6, there's a conspicuous absence of myrrh, and so that's why I have this listed as a reference here. It describes his second coming, where there will be gold and frankincense, but note that myrrh is not listed. So at the bottom of the screen there, it says, they shall bring gold and frankincense and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. So note there's no myrrh there, and the reason for that is his death is behind him. And so there's just this hint in the Old Testament that the second coming was all planned and it was all known in advance. But we only need myrrh for his death, and he will not die again. The description of Messiah, which is the first and the last who died and came to life, that's taken from chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. Don't be afraid, I am the first and the last, the living one. I was dead, but look, I am alive forever. And again, the first and the last is a frequent title of Adonai, whom we might call God the Father, and we can see that in Isaiah 41, verse 4. It also occurs 4 times in Revelation, including twice with this extra addition, who died and came to life, or was dead and am alive. So I think this indicates, just as we talked about with John 1 verse 1, where it says the Word was God, there's a blending of God the Father and God the Son going on here, and we just can't miss that Jesus in his glorified state and the Father, they share a lot of the duties. They're not exactly the same, but they're not fully distinct and separated either. I'll have some other first and last references. There's several references from Isaiah that talk about being the first and the last, and those will be on the website. Verse 9, I know how you are suffering and how poor you are, though in fact you are rich. And a tie-in reference there could be James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Regard it all joy, my brothers, when you face various kinds of temptations or trials, for you know that the testing of your trust produces perseverance. And so let's look at this word thlipsis that is used for tribulation. So on your screen, you can see a picture of the manually pressing grapes in a wine press, and this is actually connected to the root word, the thlipsis, for tribulation. It simply means pressure, and we can compare it to the pressure used to extract juice from grapes or oil from olives. So that's the kind of physical world connection that the word has. However, it does not necessarily have to denote physical persecution, though. Believers in Smyrna clearly lived their lives as a fringe group. So they were on the outskirts of society. They didn't have religious protections like we do today, for now, in our country. So they would have been ostracized. Maybe they were not even able to hold jobs, or maybe they had trouble purchasing things, especially if they didn't have their papers. And they likely were under constant threat of being arrested. So we just have to kind of put all this together. And this would have been true for Jewish as well as Gentile believers, right? They didn't follow the Roman system, so they were probably seen as skeptical, even though if you were ethnically Jewish, you had permission, but still that probably didn't keep the average citizen from looking upon them with suspicion. Non-Jewish believers had this added pressure of being required to participate in the emperor worship that we talked about earlier. So like Tom Bradford, who is a commentator, said, you don't have to be beaten to feel beaten down. And so there's this thought that just living in that society, you just must have felt horrible all the time, and feeling like you didn't fit in and just isolated and all that kind of stuff. So there may have been physical persecution, at least if you're arrested, but just the day-to-day life in that city would have been very challenging. And of course, being outside of the mainstream economy likely meant that as believers, they were materially poor. And so Jesus makes that reference there. There are actually 2 Greek words for poverty. One means simply not having anything fancy, and the other means being destitute and reduced to begging. And Jesus uses that second term, tohia. That's the word he uses here. So it's basically they're so poor that they have to beg to keep their existence. So through all of this, Jesus reminds them to keep the heavenly view. And he probably surprised them by saying that from a kingdom perspective, you are rich. You don't even know you're rich, but you're rich. And so we've said it before that a major theme of these letters is that the recipients didn't necessarily see themselves the way that Jesus saw them. And I think this cuts both ways. So certainly for the letters that have judgments, we can infer that the deficiency that Jesus is communicating probably came as a surprise to those reading the letter. But in the same way, the believers of Smyrna, they thought they were poor, they were materially poor, but they had the wrong perspective. So a message and lesson to us is we all need to have that kingdom perspective, no matter what the circumstances of our earthly situation. If we're rich on this earth, we may or may not be we may or may not be wealthy in heaven, and the converse may be true. So a simple motion of worshiping the emperor, they could have faked that, and then they would have had their papers, and that would have alleviated most of their suffering, but they didn't. And were some of them second guessing that, and maybe we should do that, but Jesus says, no, you made the right choice. Verse 9, I know the insults of those who call themselves Jews but aren't. On the contrary, they are a synagogue of the adversary, or a synagogue of Satan. Now, unfortunately, this verse has been misused, in my opinion, as an excuse to justify anti-Semitic beliefs. And so commentators will come up with all kinds of theories to say this is speaking of all Jews, and a modern synagogue is a synagogue of Satan, and it's really terrible. It's all tied to the heresy of what's called replacement theology. And replacement theology holds that because the Jews rejected their Messiah, then all of the promises that God gave to the Jewish people now are transferred to the church. And this is a problem because most importantly, it makes God a liar, because many of these promises were unconditional. So the promises to David and to Abraham were unconditional, right? They couldn't lose them if they tried. And yet, who are we to think that we've replaced the Jewish people? And actually, Romans 9, 10, 11 talks all about this. So it really shouldn't even be a thing, but unfortunately it is. So with that said, is there a way to avoid an anti-Semitic reading of this verse? And I think absolutely there is. All we have to do is follow the primary rule of Bible interpretation. And that says, you can see it on your screen there, when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. And then I've also heard it said, seek no other sense, or you'll end up with a pretense that is likely nonsense. So in other words, as Dr. Fruchtenbaum says, we take every word of Scripture at face value unless the facts or immediate context clearly indicate otherwise. Now, a literal interpretation does not rule out figures of speech, but even those have a literal background. And that's a quote from Dr. Fruchtenbaum. So this is a rule that if you ask every serious Bible commentator, they will agree with it. Yet, for whatever reason, most of those same commentators completely throw this rule out the window when it comes to verse 9 of Revelation 2. They will come up with some kind of concoction that it is true Jews who are not really Jews, but they really are Jews. And so we kind of go on this rabbit trail of making the Bible read whatever we want them to read, which is not good. So in the letter to Ephesus, though, we had a nearly identical phrase, and I think that verse really helps us frame verse 9 here. Revelation earlier said, those who call themselves, you have tried those who call themselves apostles, or you can read that, those who call themselves Christians but are not. So in that case, the meaning was obvious, right? These people are imposters. They claim to be Christians, but their behavior tells a completely different story. We might say they're Christians in name only. So after that, then how do we interpret this verse? Well, I think the plain sense reading is those who call themselves Jews but aren't means the people who are not Jews. They are imposters. They're being dishonest about their affiliation. They claim to be Jews, but their behavior tells a different story. Jews in name only. So I think it's the added thing is that in this case, this group of imposters is slandering the believers, and so I'm kind of baffled as to why commentators go to great lengths to allegorize this passage when the plain sense is kind of right in front of us, and we can see an application from just a few verses earlier. So in either case, whether a Christian or whether a Jew, if we don't live up to the high ethical standards, then we are a Christian in name only, and if a Jew's not doing that, then they're a Jew in name only. And I love 2 Samuel 12:14. I love the King James translation of it because if we're a Christian in name only, then we're like David, who claimed to be a follower of God, but acted in a way far below the standard he was called to. And 2 Samuel 12:14 says, "Howbeit, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme," meaning your behavior caused people to look poorly upon the God that you say that you represent. So I think there is a definite connection there. So just as with David, though, the good news is that there's mercy and restoration whenever we fail. But the bad news is that our behavior reflects poorly on our master, and whether we're Jewish or Christian, the same could be true. So we already have an example of Scripture just a few verses before something similar. Is there a time in Scripture where people calling themselves Jews but were not acting like Jews were called out? And as a matter of fact, there is in John chapter 8. Now the entire chapter is worth reading, but I've got the main point summarized on the screen. I'll start with reading from chapter 8, verse 39. "They answered him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. That is not what Abraham did. You are doing the works your father did." They said to him, "We are not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God." Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies." So here you've got this group of people claiming to be Jews. Jesus actually says, no, you are from your father, the devil. And it is that same type of group of people that Jesus is talking about to the letter to Smyrna. So we went through this in the Gospel Background series when we got to John 8, but as we talked about there, Jesus is not speaking to all Jews, or he's not speaking about all Jews. He's not even speaking to all Pharisees. He's speaking to a narrow subset of Pharisees who were involved in this plot to kill him. And we can prove that not all Pharisees are implicated in this because there were several Pharisees who believed in Jesus. We can name Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea as just two. And we know that all Jews were not responsible for his crucifixion. It happened very early morning on a feast day, so the vast majority of Jews would have been at home, probably asleep. And so this was really just a sly crime at the hands of very few, and probably much fewer than we realize. So to implicate an entire nation, an entire race of people, is just flat wrong. We know that tens of thousands of Jews came to faith after the resurrection. The early church was all Jewish, and it composed of all Jewish believers. So there are thousands of Jews coming to faith in Yeshua as their Messiah today. So I think it's wholly incorrect to say that it's all the Jews who are not refers to all Jews throughout history. That's just a terrible reading and unfair. Again, we know that Revelation 2 verse 2 is not speaking about all Christians, right? Just as there are corrupt Christians, we might call Christians in name only, there were and are corrupt Jews who are Jews in name only, but who really have Satan, the accuser, as their father. So I think we need to take a much more limited view of who this group is. So Jesus is basically saying their father is not Abraham, but Satan. They claim Abraham as their father, but they're really doing the works of the enemy, which is the accuser. They don't worship in a proper synagogue, but a synagogue devoted to their father Satan. So there's a little bit of play on words going on there. This is not necessarily one filled with satanic rituals, and that the Jews have been blamed for that too, which is kind of crazy. But the house of the accuser is one built on accusations. And a great example of this would be informing against one's brethren to the authorities. And so Daniel Lancaster, in his commentary, this is the position that he takes. He says informing and accusing one's neighbor is expressly prohibited by the Torah. Jews who were doing this were behaving exactly like the Jews Jesus was contrasting in John 8. They weren't upholding the high ethical standards God expects of his followers. So we know Leviticus 19:18 says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And so while the Jews debated as to who their neighbor was, we see the Good Samaritan parable kind of exemplifies that. Unquestionably, Jews in that day would have considered Gentiles and Jews who worship together in the same synagogue, they would have considered them their neighbor. They were supposed to love their neighbor and not accuse them. So there are other views that are probably equally plausible. Lazorkin sees that this may be fake converts who are trying to avoid persecution. There's another group that thinks that these are Gentiles. Maybe Fruchtenbaum sees Rome and their anti-Messiah structure as impersonating the one true God and his Messiah. So that's, that could be an example of they're claiming to be like the Jewish religion, they're claiming to be better than the Jewish religion, but they actually aren't. So, and any of those could be valid. But I think what's not correct is to affix this label to those who really are Jewish, and they've done nothing to disavow that status. They're just being faithful to the commands. So also keep in mind that as of this letter, there was no separate Gentile Christian religion that was separate from Judaism. They were together. So Jesus and Paul both make it clear that the kingdom is for the Jew first, and we Gentiles are included only by God's grace. Paul even warns us not to become proud, and I think that's exactly what some of these commentators have done. They become proud and feel the need to take the Jews down a rung or two. So basically, I encourage a careful study of Romans 9 through 11 because I think the Holy Spirit anticipated this view and in advance wrote to counteract it, but unfortunately it's not heeded as well as it should be. So that's Romans 9, 10, and 11. So now this is a point in a typical letter where Jesus would say, but I have this against you. But note, he doesn't say that to Smyrna. And we've got that exemplified by a blank screen here. Jesus has two churches that do not receive any judgment. That would be Smyrna and Philadelphia. And so this is why, again, we have a blank screen. So I think this is good to keep in mind when we're going through a trial, because when going through a trial, we often feel that God has abandoned us. And maybe some of us feel that we've done something wrong. And maybe God's judging us by sending us the trial. The letter to Smyrna actually corrects that thinking. Just because there is tribulation in our lives doesn't mean that it's a judgment from God. And in Smyrna's case, it clearly wasn't. So as Dr. Lazorkin points out, the concept of things not truly being as they appear is a trademark of apocalyptic literature. And so as we mentioned in the early lessons, one reason that God gives us revelations, plural, meaning multiple in the Old Testament and in the New, is to communicate that even though things seem bad on earth, God is still in control. Verse 10, don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Look, the adversary is going to throw some of you in prison in order to put you to the test, and you will face an ordeal for 10 days. Remain faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your crown. So don't fear is a major theme in the book of Revelation. In fact, it's a major theme throughout Scripture. There are over 150 times where we see this phrase, do not fear. Now, some people say there's 365 times. That's not quite true, but it's there often enough to make the point that God does not want us to fear. Even though things are bad, even though things seem bad, even though things seem like they're falling apart, don't fear. And what, unfortunately for the church at Smyrna, is not only are things bad, Jesus is saying things are going to get worse. Even though you may be unjustly thrown in jail, do not fear. Even though you may end up dying, do not fear. Jesus reminds them that it is Satan who is the accuser or the adversary who is behind all this. So we only see earthly combatants, but God shows us that there is a much bigger picture spiritually. So maybe the Romans at the hands doing all this, but behind that is the adversary, capital A, which in Hebrew comes across as Satan. So scholars don't know exactly what this 10 days means. If we take it literally, there might have been a period of 10 days coming where there was some wave of intense persecution, maybe something like a pogrom that the European Jews had to go through. But proponents of the church age theory have come up with a list of 10 Roman emperors between the years 50 and 311 who persecuted the church. And so that's kind of ties into that theory. You start with Nero, and then Domitian, and then Trajan, and then Marcus Aurelius, and then a few others getting down to Diocletian in the early 300s. So Fox's Book of Martyrs says that there's 5 million believers who died for Christ during this period. So in some ways, this 10 emperors fits. It's not saying that there were only 10 emperors, but 10 emperors where there was state-sponsored persecution. So Jesus closes with, I will give you life as your crown. And what's interesting there is the priests of all those deities that we mentioned in Smyrna, they wore like a laurel or a crown of leaves in honor of their service. And so Jesus says his faithful will receive a crown in honor of their service, but one that will not fade. It'll be a permanent crown. And then to close out the letter, those who have ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the Messianic communities. He who wins the victory will not be hurt at all by the second death. So we'll find out more about the second death once we get to Revelation 20. I've got some verses on the screen. 20 verse 6, Blessed and holy is anyone who has a part in the first resurrection. Over him the second death has no power. On the contrary, they will become Kohanim, or priests of God and of the Messiah, and they will rule with him for the 1,000 years. 14, then death and Sheol were hurled into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. 21 verse 8, but as for the cowardly, the untrustworthy, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, we looked at that on the last video, those involved with the occult and with drugs, idol worshippers, all liars, their destiny is the lake burning with fire and sulfur, the second death. So there's a quip, born once, die twice, born twice, die once. So born again believers will be spared the second death, while the unrepentant who are not born again get to die once on this earth, and then in the future they will be cast into the second death. So that's really it for the verse by verse through the letter to Smyrna. Now let's move on to our three speculation areas and just kind of see if what they have to say and see if they fit. So proponents of the church age theory see Smyrna as representative of the persecuted church, really from 170, but maybe a little before that, to 312. And that's exemplified by those 10 Roman emperors that we talked about earlier, and I've got a list of those on our website. So this all came to an end with the Edict of Toleration, and that's where basically Christianity was decriminalized, if you want to look at it that way. That was around 311 between emperors Galerius and Constantine. And then the full legalization of Christianity occurred around either 313 by Constantine. But then that ushered in a whole new set of problems that we'll get to when we look at the next church, the Church of Pergamum. So the possible kingdom parable connection here is the wheat and the tares. So Matthew 13 verse 24, Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while people were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, then went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads of grain, the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seeds in your field? Where have these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The servants asked him, Do you want us to go and pull them up? He said, No, because if you pull up the weeds, you might uproot some of the wheat at the same time. Let them both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers to collect the weeds first, tie them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. And so some possible connections here. We see the enemy came and sowed weeds. That would be the accuser or adversary or Satan that is referenced in the letter to Smyrna. So weeds would be those who looked like the faithful. So when this particular weed grows up, it looks like a wheat. It looks very similar. But it's not, and it's actually toxic if you don't separate them. So the weeds look like the faithful, but on the contrary are imposters. And so the weeds also appeared. That would be the time of persecution, where the imposters are alongside and maybe accusing the proper wheat, the brethren. And then down at verse 30, let them grow together. So the wheat will have to suffer with the weeds or from the weeds for a time. Note the weeds are pulled from the ground and then burned. That's the second death, right? They're yanked up from the ground. That's the first death. And then burned, which is the second death, which very much corresponds to the lake of fire verses that we read on the couple of slides back. But the wheat that's pulled from the ground, so that's the first death. But then they're gathered into the master's house, and people see no second death there. And then the possible connection with the 7 cities that Paul wrote to would be the letter to the Philippians. And this letter is all about joy through suffering. I've got a bunch of verses on the screen. I encourage you to pause the video and read through each of these. I'll just go through a couple of them. Philippians 1 verse 6, I am sure of this, he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So we have the church in Smyrna kind of wondering why they're going through this, and they felt poor. But Jesus reminds them that they're rich, and very similar to this verse we just read. Of course, a famous verse, Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. So Jesus is saying you may have to die for your faith. Jesus is not going to remove them out of the time of tribulation. He's going to let them go through it, but they will be a testimony. If they happen to die, they'll be a testimony for his sake. Verse 29, for it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but suffer for his sake. So I don't know where we as believers get the opinion that we will not have to suffer, because it's all through this book, and it's really all through much of the New Testament. Verse 2 of chapter 2, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourself. So to me, this speaks to the importance of being who you say you are. If you follow God, you need to act like it. And that's another sub-theme that happened in the letter to Smyrna. Some more verses, chapter 2, verse 7. But Jesus emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Jesus sets the model that there comes a time where you may have to give up your life. Holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. So the reference to get your crown may be a parallel there. Verse 17, if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. So joy through suffering, again, is a major theme there. Again, pause the video here and go ahead and read the rest of these verses. And then probably the famous verse on joy through suffering, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. So be an example for the world around you. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things, or think on these things. And then, of course, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And it's interesting, verse 22 doesn't really pertain to the letter to Smyrna, but I just think it's interesting. All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household. So the testimony was so powerful that it even reached the interior corridors of Rome in Caesar's palace. I just think that's really neat. So if we complete our summary table here, so to Smyrna, which means myrrh or death, the title that Jesus speaks of himself is the first and the last, the one who was dead but is alive. He says, I know your suffering, your pressing, your tribulation. I know your insults. There is no judgment given. So this is one of the two exceptions that we'll see. The secondary encouragement is do not fear suffering. In fact, it's probably going to get worse. Remain faithful. He who has an ear phrase comes before the promise, and we'll see that changes once we get to the letter to Thyatira. And the promise to the overcomer is he that overcomes will not taste the second death. And then we just looked at verses from Philippians. We compared the wheat and the tare parable, and the church age, if we follow that theory, would be that Smyrna models the persecuted church. So that is the letter to Smyrna. And next time we will take a look at the letter to Pergamum.